Similar to all the tools we've been talking about so far in this chapter, there are a bunch of hue versus tools that allow us to make either very broad selections or very narrow targeted selections. So let's take a look at those now. And you're going to find them here in the custom curves. In the custom curves pull-down menu, you're going to find not only the custom curves, but hue versus hue, saturation, and luminance. We'll start by looking at hue versus hue. I'll pull that up, and what we've got is a center dividing line, and then what looks like a color wheel stretched out into a straight line. So what happens is, as we get to this end of the graph, we're actually wrapping around back into our reds. The center line allows us to adjust whatever this versus parameter is. In this case, it's hue. So what we're going to do is select a hue in this color wheel, and then make a change by moving this line, and it will adjust the hue of that color. Just like we did on the custom curves, I can hover over here and select a color. So let's select a color that isn't too predominant in this image. Let's try green. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this green, and it adds some control points as well as a center point. These control points limit the effect of what we're about to do. So I'll click and drag up one way, and it's kind of working, but the control points are a little too narrow. This is very frequently happens here in DaVinci Resolve. I can highlight that point. I can click and drag, but what I really usually do is I'll highlight a point and come down here into these two text inputs, because it allows me to widen this out without moving it up or down ever so slightly. I can never quite click and drag it perfectly and keep the hue rotate down to 0, because that's what we're doing. We're rotating the hue based on the color we've selected. So I'm going to take this input hue and just open this up a little bit. Then I'll select this other control point and open up that input hue a little bit. It's also Option F, so we get a better look at our image. And you can see those greens are now starting to rotate around. If I pull up the vector scope, let's go to the one-up. Let's go to the vector scope. We have to kick up the traces. There we go. Very colorful, bright image. As I start rotating this around, you can see that there's a small little element in here that's moving counterclockwise or clockwise around the vector scope. So this is a very narrow targeted correction. I can go in the complete opposite direction, reset this, put a single point, and it doesn't matter where I put that single point. Because there's no control points, I am literally doing a big old hue rotate, just like if we're in page 1 in our color wheels and I adjust the hue over here. It's the exact same move, just using a completely different interface. Let's hide our scopes. Let's take a look at our shots. Let's select one more shot just to see another view of this. One thing I like using this for is skin tones. So in fact, I'm going to come into shot 2 because I got a lot more skin tones in here. I'll shift F, and oftentimes what I'll do is use it to move skin tones ever so slightly. So I'll click on a skin tone. It puts a dot with 2 control points. And now I can go and isolate those skin tones and really make a very subtle adjustment. This is a terrific way, if someone's just a little too ruddy, maybe they're a little too green, to make a very subtle adjustment on them and rotate those skin tone hues into something more healthy, or in this case, if we wanted them to look like aliens, a little more green. Let's go ahead and reset this control, and let's take a look at hue versus saturation. It's exactly the same interface, except now when we select a hue, we're now going to adjust the saturation. So I'll select this blue dress by clicking on it. Gives me some automatic control points. And now I can adjust the saturation of the dress. And I can do both of these simultaneously. I could come in here and select this blue dress and rotate it red while also working on the saturation of the dress. So each of these are independent controls. You can use them simultaneously. Let's go ahead and reset both of these. Then finally there's hue versus luminance, and this is one I almost never ever use because it introduces macro blocking if I'm working on compressed footage. like ProRes or Avid DNX HD, I just tend to see all of those compression artifacts. Let's go to another shot and let's see what happens if we take this blue and try to brighten it. And what I'm going to do is, instead of clicking on the actual blue, let's use the shortcuts down here. So let's select blue, and you can see it put blue as a center point and then added 2 control points, nice and broad. I kind of like how these control points tend to be placed because it's a little bit broader of a control, which usually gets me what I want a little bit quicker. And now let's go ahead and brighten up this image. What happens when we hit play? Do we see any particular, yeah, you can see all this macro blocking going on in here. This is what happens generally on compressed footage when I use the hue versus luminance control. So if I want to brighten up a particular color, I'll usually pull a key or find another way of isolating that particular color, and then using my 3-way controls or using a custom curve to make that brightness change. So you can see why I tend not to use this particular control, this hue versus luma control, because it tends to induce all of this macro blocking, and I tend to work with a lot of compressed codecs that are subject to this type of problem. But the hue versus curves in general are awesome. I'm in them all the time. Great little secondaries. Yeah, if you don't put any control points, they can be used as big honking primaries. But I tend to always put control points. I use them to solve very specific problems. And there are 2 other curves what we're going to look at next.